I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and we're delighted to be part of National Infrastructure Week. There are a series of events starting in Washington on Monday, continuing throughout the country, and our partner at the Brookings Institution is involved with many of those events. So we're delighted to have Rob Puentes and so many of you who are experts or are just feeling the pain in the room. I know that you've likely been part of a conversation, not maybe exactly like that, although we'll put Hollywood to work anywhere we can, but we've had these conversations. So we intentionally wanted to do something a little different today. And honestly, if we'd called this Celebrating Chicagoland's Infrastructure History, would you be here today? Our infrastructure is a tremendous asset. We've been the transportation crossroads throughout our history. There's many good examples of projects that have been well managed, that are visionary, that are being executed well. We could talk a lot about that, but it's not at a scale that's moving the needle on our economic development and growth. This region has been listed as 18 among the top metropolitan regions for growth. And given our infrastructure, we are capable of so much more. We have a diverse economy, and that's what we're here today to talk about. So broken, and out of time refers to the fact that we have to act, not years from now. We have been having this conversation for far too long, but now, here we are in mid-May. On May 31st, both the federal transportation bill and our General Assembly in Illinois is scheduled to adjourn. So what better time than to have this conversation now about what has happened around the country that we can learn from, that we can adapt, what are the ideas that we can put into play, and a little bit of humor to motivate us out of our complacency. There are solutions from all over the country, and so I'm delighted that you've decided to spend time with us here today. You heard from Dave Cohn at the Union League Club. They're a tremendous partner on this. In addition to the Brookings Institution and a number of you that are either Chicago or national representatives of international institutions, we're also partnering today with the Value of Water Coalition that you'll hear from Radhika Fox during our water panel later today. So we've got a lot of experts, local and national, and with an international smattering in the room. This event today was made possible by a lot of volunteers, staff who we just thanked, who put a lot of creative energy into this, and our sponsors. So BMO Harris is our lead sponsor today. I also want to recognize our benefactor sponsor, White & Company, and our patrons, Associated Equipment Distributors and HBK Engineering. Let's give our sponsors a round of applause for making this possible. Those of you who may be joining us today for the first time may not be familiar with the Metropolitan Planning Council. We celebrated our 80th year last year, and for all that time, we've been problem solvers on behalf of the growth, competitiveness, equity, livability of the greater metropolitan Chicago region. We're selfishly grounded in this metropolitan region, but we think that the ideas and solutions that are piloted and refined here can help cities and regions everywhere. And so we're committed to that urban revitalization agenda literally everywhere. And we have a bias for innovative and pragmatic solutions. So we're not in the business, we're not interested in producing data and reports that get added to the pile. We try to time our advocacy, our research, our demonstration projects to opportunities for action. And that's exactly where we are right now with infrastructure. Great cities and regions constantly reinvent themselves. That's been Chicago's story since the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The building blocks of a great urban area are a strong economy, well-managed natural assets, vibrant neighborhoods, and infrastructure that ties it all together. Not just the asphalt that we like to blow up in Hollywood movies, but the quality public buildings, our transportation network of all modes, water, stormwater, broadband. Those are all the pieces, when we use that catch-all word of infrastructure, that make it possible for our region to grow. So while we have been growing at an anemic pace recently, if we act wisely, our corridors of infrastructure investment become corridors for economic growth. MPC has done this work never alone, but always in partnership with colleagues in the government sector, in the not-for-profit sector, at the community and civic level, and also with our partners in the private sector. So we We connect those dots across a big geography and a big range of issues, and we do that to move an agenda forward. We've built trust over time, so thank you for being both willing to spend your time here, but also to continue to do the work together. And I think that's why we're tapped by leaders in government, whether it would be Mayor Emanuel, when he had his transition team for his first term, we helped staff the Transportation Committee. More recently with Governor Rauner, I was a co-chair of the infrastructure transition team there. These are things that we add to our already full plate because they're important. They're opportunities to grab, and we are very pleased to do that. So you're going to hear a lot more from experts today about the infrastructure challenges. One of the statistics that always focuses my mind is that the overall federal budget is $3.5 trillion, and the infrastructure needs over multiple years at a national level are pegged at $3.6 trillion. So, you know, we got a problem where supply and demand are not in alignment. And the numbers can lull us, they can numb us. That is a challenge. And so it's important to focus on the real life impacts, whether it's the tragedy yesterday evening in Philadelphia with Amtrak, or right in our own backyard. You don't have to go very far from here on the north side to see the falling concrete from the Western Avenue bypass that's going to be deconstructed, but it's been dangerous. You only have to go to our southwest part of our region and go to the Joliet courthouse. Its floor is collapsing. Or in the time that I've been talking to you, around the United States, 5 water mains have busted. So we've got a problem. It's not tomorrow, it's today. And what can we do about it? Well, being here is a good start. We also invite you to join Accelerate Illinois at accelerateillinois.com. This is our coalition for state action right away. And what we've been doing is stealing some lessons from other places that have been successful. About 18 states have acted in the last couple of years, and we want Illinois to be on that list. What have they done? They've identified the projects and brought together the unusual coalition of voices to say, here's the need, here's the costs we all pay as individuals and businesses, and here are the things that are on our list but are unfunded that are maintenance projects, they're nuts and bolts making our economy work. And so what I'm not saying is that we start the conversation with a debate about revenue and what the price tag is. That's where we've fallen into a trap as a state again and again and again. So please join us in Accelerate Illinois. We're going to be talking about lots of tools. It's not just all on the backs of the federal or state governments. We know that that's unrealistic. We know we have to be designing our own solutions, and so one of our panels today is about innovative infrastructure financing. Intermediaries clearly have a role to play here in Illinois, and we're going to be learning a lot from how those solutions have been put into place around the country. These are tough conversations. We need to raise the volume on our voices about a dedicated revenue source, better investments that are decided by criteria where we can really show people what they're going to get for their money and that we pick wisely. We can't do everything. And these new financing tools that there's some fear about, but we know that a fair distribution of risk and responsibilities has been done well, both here in Chicago and elsewhere. So today's event brings together partners who know about how to unlock the solutions for growth. The result of today's session, we hope, will have an impact literally over the next couple of weeks or whatever timetable we find ourselves on. I know that's unpredictable in the General Assembly's calendar right now. But a capital bill is expected. Even though we have a lot of problems in Illinois on pensions and budgets, we have to have something that grows our economy. And Governor Rauner could not have been more clear during his campaign and his transition team that a healthy state needs both an operating budget and a capital budget every year. So we're here to add our voices to those that say we need a capital bill right now. So share your ideas. If you're tweeting today, the hashtags are InfraWeek and Rebuild Renew. And in addition to some fact gathering and learning and networking, we hope to also inject some fun. And we're going to start with that right now. The keypad polling that you received on the orange band is not going to work if you bring it home tonight and try it in front of your TV. So please don't walk away with it. But we're going to be using it throughout the day. If you're not familiar with keypad polling, It's pretty simple technology. You can actually push an answer as many times as you want. It will only record the last one. So if you mess up and you want to push a different number, go ahead and do that. We're just going to leave this first question open for practice for a minute. So if we can pull up the first question, we'll do an easy demo. We want to know who is in the room by sector. So if you can please indicate, we've got the higher ed and government, civic, not-for-profit, and then a number of different cross-sections of the private sector, including a catch-all at the end. So please indicate where your primary work is. And we'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. You're getting the hang of it. Okay. All right. So we've got a lot of experts in the room who know the business from the transportation and engineering perspective. But we've also got a lot of folks from the public sector who are decision makers. That was one of our goals today, to get the right people in the room who want to be part of the solution and to offer our assistance. And then a lot of the change agent organizations that make up the civic sector. So those are the top three. And I'm delighted that we have such a great cross-section. Throughout the day, we're going to be returning to this with a few questions related to a bracket, a May Madness bracket. So we'll walk out of here with some results on that, too. And we may also have some guest appearances from a few other comedians who have something to say on infrastructure throughout the day. So we wanted to start out this day very appropriately with someone who has been a tremendously valued partner to MPC, and that's Randy Blankenhorn, who is now the Secretary of the Illinois Department of Transportation. Randy, most of you know, had a history in state government earlier. He was a trailblazer in IDOT previously, but he really had to play the trailblazer role when two prior entities were combined to create the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, as our metropolitan planning organization, and much, much more a number of years ago. And Randy was really the perfect leader. He understood the way that infrastructure connects with everything from disadvantaged communities to affordable housing, to education and public safety, a lot of things that our regional planning entities in the past had not grappled with. So Randy brought his transportation and infrastructure expertise to bear on a whole regional plan that we've adopted and updated called Go to 2040, and he brings that deep knowledge of the importance of involving local communities to his work at IDOT. So Governor Rauner chose very wisely in selecting Randy. He is having an extremely busy couple weeks doing a listening tour across Illinois. I think you mentioned, Randy, that you did 4 one-day recently, speaking engagements in one day. So we're delighted that this worked out. It's one of several events, other events public in Chicago today, and many, many others throughout our region and state. So Randy's going to use this excellent group of experts both to share what he's been starting to hear, but to also engage us in the tough work ahead. Randy Blankenhorn, welcome.
Good morning. It's good to be home. I am not one of the comedians that she mentioned. But on behalf of the governor, thanks everybody for coming this morning and spending some time with us. As Mary Sue said, we are in the midst of a statewide listening tour. We told the governor that we thought we could maybe do in the 4-week period that he allowed, we could maybe do 20 cities. We are scheduled in 39. And so we are off and all over this great state. We're a little more than 2/3 of the way through. I think, Justine, that I've probably done 22 of these already personally, and it's been very enjoyable. It's been an interesting process for us to really get to hear from people, and that's what we're going to do mostly today. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes, but mostly I want to hear from you. What matters? Why does it matter? Why is it important? How does it impact your communities? How does it impact your business? How does it impact your residents? Why does investment in transportation in particular and infrastructure in general matter? And why should we be pushing for it? A few of the things that you all know around this room, but we are the 3rd largest interstate and bridge system in the country. We have the 2nd largest transit system. We have the world's busiest airport, along with 80 other public airports that drive our local economies. We're the only state in the country where all 7 Class I railroads operate. We're the only connection between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico, and we are bounded by water. We are transportation. Transportation, what drives this economy. It's what makes us what we are. It is our global economic advantage, and we need to invest in that advantage as we move forward. We're the freight hub of North America. We need to think about how we can grow jobs in this industry that really matters for us. Transportation, distribution, logistics is one of the few in this state areas where we are seeing significant job growth. How do we maintain that? How do we grow it? How do we use the infrastructure advantage that is Illinois to make that difference? You know that I came from the regional planning agency here, and I have a different view a little bit about what this economy of the state of Illinois is, and I don't actually believe it's one economy. I believe it's a series of regional economies, and I believe that we need to connect those economies. It's the Chicago region connecting to St. Louis, to Indianapolis, to Peoria, to Champaign, to Rock Island. It's how do all of those connect in a way that's meaningful and grows all of our economies and makes us all strong. And that connection truly is about transportation. It's about how we connect people. It's about how we connect those economies. It's how we move things throughout this state. Congestion and reliability are a concern for us, as they are for you. But I actually want to focus more on the reliability side. I tell people if we don't have any congestion at all, that's probably not a good thing. It means our economy is not moving. It's more the reliability issues for us. For those of you that I met with over the years when I was at CMAP, you probably didn't know it, but I was almost always 45 minutes early because I refused to be late. And I didn't know how long it was always going to take me, and some days it'd take me a half hour, and some days it'd take me an hour and a half, and so I wasted a lot of time in coffee shops. We've got to talk about how we make this system more reliable, and it's not just for commuters. When we were in Bloomington a couple of weeks ago, an executive with Mitsubishi said, you know, Randy, my warehouses are your highways. That's how we move things anymore. Just-in-time delivery for us means literally just in time, and if your system isn't reliable, if we can't count on it, we're going to move jobs somewhere else. We've got to invest in that in a way that really makes this work. But it's about more than the economy. It's about our communities. It's about access to health care. It's about access to schools. It's about access to jobs. It's about access to recreation. It's about access to the things people care about. Transportation defines so many of our communities, what it looks like, how it operates, how it functions. Does its downtown work? That's really a function of how that transportation system works. Does the train station fit in with it? Does it make sure that it's a part of the community and not just a place where people get off and pick up their dry cleaning and go home? How does that transportation system add value? Chris Reed, who's my deputy secretary, was the director of highways when I was at CMAP, and we had a conversation, and she said, you know, Randy, they're my state highways. And I said, yeah, Chris, they are, but they're our main streets. And we have to think of them like that. We have to think about how we move people and goods in a regional and a sub-regional manner, but how we utilize those main streets of commerce in your communities to grow your towns, to grow your communities, to grow your cities. We also have to think much more broadly about alternatives to the car. My kids aren't going to travel the way that I traveled. They don't want to travel the way that I travel, and we've got to make sure that we have options. We have to make sure that public transit works and it works well, that we connect with our passenger rail systems, that we have walkable communities where people can walk and bike and get to places in a way that they want to and not defined by the way the street grid and the street system happens. It's not just here. Every community that I've been in, from Macomb to Champaign, has said transit has to work in their communities. It has to be an option for people today, not just tomorrow, but today. And beyond that, in our rural communities, it's a big concern for people who, if my mother can't drive anymore, she still needs to get to the doctor. And how do we make sure that happens, and how do we grow those alternatives? We have challenges, don't get me wrong. We have gotten into a habit of boom and bust cycles of transportation funding. We do a capital bill, and we do a lot of work for 5 or 6 years. and then we get to the cliff and we don't do much at all. It's not good for the way we have to do business. It's not good for our local government partners who can't plan on the resource they're going to get. They're not good for our construction partners who can't decide if they need to hire people, who can't afford to buy equipment because they don't know what tomorrow brings. We've got to get away from that. We've got to find a new sustainable way to fund transportation. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit with you today. We're at that cliff right now in Illinois. We knew this was coming. This is not a result of some budget snafu. When we did Illinois Jobs Now, we bonded all that money, and the bonds are gone. And now we have to think about what we're going to do tomorrow because we are at the cliff and have to decide where we're going to head from here. We do pretty good at borrowing in Illinois. We know how to do it. But if you only take one phrase away from today, from me, I'd like it to be pay as you go. We need to have a mechanism where we fund the maintenance of this vast system that we have on a regular basis and don't count on these boom and bust cycles. You don't bond money for maintenance. You get money and you pay for it for 25 years, and in that 25-year period, you have to rebuild a road 3 times. That doesn't make any sense, and we've got to find a way to make sure that we take these peaks and valleys of funding out and have a sustainable way to do that. When we did Illinois First in 2001, we told people that if we didn't do something soon, we would have 3,000 miles of Illinois roadway that would need immediate repair. We are in the midst of our 2015 to 2020 program. At the end of this program, if we don't find some revenue and we don't find a new way to invest, we will have 5,000 miles of roads that need immediate assistance. We'll have countless bridges that will be inadequate. Our ports, which already can't accommodate the kind of vessels that are going to want to come in, are not going to be adequate. Our rails and our buses will deteriorate. Our airports won't meet our needs. We need to find a new way, and we need to find it soon. Governor Rauner talks about fixing transportation funding for a generation, not for a 5-year period, and that's the conversation I would like you all to have today as we think about how we invest in our infrastructure. Having said that, as Mary Sue mentioned, we have a general revenue problem in this state, and we've got to fix that. The General Assembly and the governor made some hard decisions to fix the FY15 budget. They're going to have to make even tougher decisions to fix 2016, but unless we fix those, we can't even get to the conversation about capital that we know will drive tomorrow's economy and create tomorrow's jobs. So I urge you to support them as they move into this conversation about how to fix general revenue so we can have that conversation. What I want to do mostly with you is to talk about what you care about. And I've said we've tried this, and I have to admit, this is the biggest room we've tried this in. But what we've done is ask people to tell us why this matters. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to your business? What does it mean to your community about transportation? What are we doing well? What are we not? We've said let's not have it be about projects. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about projects. And so rather than talking about whether we should extend rail line X, let's talk about why that matters. What does it mean? Why should we make that investment? At the end of this tour, I will make a report to the governor and to the Illinois General Assembly about what I heard. And so I tell people, if you don't have anything to tell me, I don't have anything to tell them. So I'm hopeful we can have a conversation here for a little while about what this is and why it matters, and then we're going to have, after that, a very interesting conversation with a group of panelists that are going to take your thoughts a little bit further. So with that, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for being a part of this, and I'd like to open it up and have a conversation about what you think. Who wants to start this off?
Mr. Secretary, John Trotta, it's good to see you. My thoughts on transportation infrastructure are a bit different than others. There's no question the roads and bridges and buildings and sewers are collapsing, but the human factor is important. We talk about broken, and no time left. In this state of ours, we have to do better. People every day have lost the opportunity for the American dream. People have lost families, lost their homes, and moved on. When we invest in infrastructure, we all know it creates a lot of jobs and opportunities. We're very fortunate in this state to have a governor and yourself pushing this program forward. But the need in the state legislature, if you're a person about to vote on this, They want to know, what does it mean to their people? They want to know that their region and their districts are taken care of. But that's really the human factor. When I talk to legislators, they've told me, we've heard about the collapsing bridges and the roads, but what else? Who in the community is going to come out and stand up and say, it's time for a change, it's time to invest, and it's time to put our people back to work? That's the way I look at it, and hopefully we can get that to resonate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And people have asked me, so Randy, what have you heard new on this tour? And I've heard a lot new. I've heard some interesting things. But mostly it's been about those stories, John. It's been about the things that people tell me about why it matters. I was in Des Plaines last week at one of these, and a elementary school principal said, Randy, here's your problem. I have 4-year-olds on a bus for an hour each way on the way to school. And I said, that's just unacceptable. That's a problem. That's what we have to solve. It's not about extending that road. It's not about a new transit line. It's about what this means. How does it make a difference in your family? Why the heck do I have to leave work at 3 o'clock to get to my daughter's 5:30 soccer game? That's what matters, and I think that's the stories that we're hearing a lot of. I saw another one in the back.
Good morning. I'm Karen Lehman with Fresh Taste, and I had the pleasure of being part of the food group for the Go To 2040 plan, and also now with Farm Illinois, which is a report that will be released May 19th, which has a strong infrastructure component. And in that report, we talk about the importance of Chicago in connecting Illinois with the global economy, but also some of the issues we face just even getting food into Chicago with the choke points around the outside. And so I want to signal that I think there's interest in figuring out how to manage some of those choke points so that the local and regional food economy can serve consumers in Chicago, and just wondered about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question we have those points, and that's where we have to focus. We got to focus on where that congestion causes unreliability, where it causes real issues, whether it's right here in the metropolitan area or across the state. I remember the work that you all did on the Go To 2040 plan, and we know how to grow food, and we know that it is where that distribution system works that makes local food hard, and we've got to work with you to help make that happen. That's a partnership we've got to create in a better way with our local governments. Yeah.
Good morning. Linda Nguyen Perez with Jobs to Move America. I wanted to ask you, and go back to the question about jobs, about how we can use our infrastructure investments, in particular transportation, and think about how we use the purchase of our buses and trains to create manufacturing jobs for the region. In particular, given that the Pullman site has historically meant so much to the region, how we think about reviving manufacturing jobs, creating middle-class jobs in particular for women, veterans, communities of color, low-income folks. Thank you.
Yeah, in my old position, which the other day I actually started by saying it's good to be here from CMAP, and I'm not there anymore. But we talked a lot about the fact that manufacturing in metropolitan Chicago is not dead. And there's a lot of asset here, and the transportation infrastructure is a major reason why we still have some advantage. We have to be able to move parts in and out. We've got to be able to move finished goods in and out. There's an advantage here that we need to continue to try to capitalize on. Specifically the transit pieces, when I was out doing some of this work in Kane County and in DuPage County, and people would say, yeah, Randy, the transportation infrastructure is important to me, but I got to get people to work. And that's a problem for me. How do I get my workers here? How do I make sure that the transit system is accommodating to make sure that it fits the schedules that I have so that we can get people that really want and need these jobs into my facilities? We have to have a transit system that works. You cannot be a world-class city and a world-class state if you don't have transit that works. And so we need to continue to figure out how to invest in that in a way that we're not always competing against education and childcare for resources. But I think that's one of the things that we want to try to figure out. Yes.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Ram Kumar. I'm from Arcadis. Some of the comments that you made were right on in terms of the changing needs of our population, the millennials and the seniors and so on. And more we're looking at the concept of traditional transportation being replaced by the concept of mobility, and how we bring technology into helping the different parts of the population travel and meet their needs. And more we are seeing that in the budgets that come out of whether it's the federal transportation budget or whether it's the local budgets, the technology part is not explicitly talked about. It's hidden somewhere. And more we are seeing, if you go to APTA conferences and so on, we are seeing overseas in Europe and Finland and so on, they are focusing more on the use of technology in integrating multimodal mobility for people. And I was wondering your thoughts on how you're dealing with that.
Yeah, we need to use technology to give people better choices, to make them understand in real time what their options are. People don't sit in traffic congestion on purpose. We've got to give them that information. We have these great overhead message signs on our interstate system that tell me how late I'm going to be. That's basically what they tell me. We've got to show options. We've got to make sure that that we're giving people the right information to make good choices. Bus tracker, train tracker here in Chicago, in Metropolitan Chicago, was maybe the greatest thing that we've done in a long time. We can make a bus faster on Ashland Avenue, but if I'm still standing at the bus stop waiting for 8, 9, 10 minutes because I don't know when the bus is coming, it doesn't really do me any good. It's giving people that good information where they can make choices. The technology is already there. We are certainly not ahead of the game, and we need to get back into that race. I've talked a lot about IDOT in particular, and this is not just an IDOT issue. That IDOT used to be the most innovative DOT in the country, and we're not anymore. We are going to be again, and this is some of the ways we've got to figure out how to use technology in ways that make people smarter about how they're using our system. So I'm with you on that. Yeah. Do you have that?
Oh.
No, go
Hi,
ahead.
my name is Peter Garrepy with Amtrak. Although my question and comment is more just as a taxpayer and a resident of the state. And it is, I guess, is there any initiative for a dedicated funding stream? Now, as a taxpayer and as a homeowner in the state, I'm happy to pay a higher income tax if I know that increment is going towards a dedicated infrastructure trust in the state. So I guess I would just push for that. I'm happy to pay higher taxes if I know that there's going to be a material and a noticeable and a sustainable benefit to something that impacts every single person in this state. So you mentioned the 4-year-olds going to school, to a senior trying to get to a doctor's appointment. For me, just trying to get to work. For my neighbors, for the value of my home, I'm happy to pay higher taxes if I know that it's going towards something that will benefit. So.
Yeah, we have to rebuild trust. And part of that is using the money that we say in the way we said we were going to use it. Back some years ago, we were able to get capital programs through on a pretty regular basis. Jim Riley here in the front remembers those days. And it's because we told people what we were going to do with the money, and we went out and did it. And we've got to get back to that. If you can't trust that you're going to give us transportation money and we're going to use it wisely, that we're going to use a new way of making decisions that are performance-based, that meet goals, that have value to you, then you shouldn't give us more money. We've got to build that trust that we are doing the right thing and that it's worth spending. I think you all agree, probably, at least in this room, that more infrastructure money is a good idea. You got to trust that we're going to use it in the right way, and we're out trying to rebuild that trust. Yeah.
Hi, Randy. This is Marta Perales. I wanted to say thank you for being here. Just another comment on connecting our regions. I'm from the Kankakee County, and obviously the lack of coordination out there is troubling, but I'm glad that you guys are doing the listening tours. I can actually catch a bus from Mantina, Illinois to Midway Airport, but I can't catch a train from, say, Kankakee to University Park, so just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And yeah, those connections, again, are really important. I saw someone have one here. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jack.
Randy, Jack Hartman from Arcadis. New York Port Authority has got a great, New York and New Jersey has a great funding mechanism using tolls to pay for transit. We all know that transit takes people off the road so that people who are driving a car, there's more people on the Blue Line than on the Kennedy itself. How do we make this connection, and how do we do it in a funding mechanism that will help transit as a whole?
Yeah, I think we have to look at it that way. You know, we are a multimodal system, and as I've told people over the last 3 weeks, we talk about it in a very good way. We don't walk the walk very well. And I think we've got to figure out that funding streams, for one thing, are not in these boxes that we put them in, that we've got to talk about how we use funding to make the best solution, to make the best decision, and we've got to have that flexibility in our funding. We've got to talk about more than just gas taxes and registration fees. You know, you all know from my past, I'm a user fee kind of guy. That's what I believe in. But as we walk through this process, you know, there are beneficiaries of the system that don't pay. There's a lot of people that don't drive, that choose not to drive. That's great. But their TV gets into their living room and their groceries get to the grocery store. And we've got to think about all beneficiaries of the system and how they fund the system, and then how we fairly allocate that back across a multimodal system in a way that makes sense. We can't afford not to have the Blue Line work or the Kennedy as a parking lot. And so we've got to really think about that equity and the flexibility in our funding to make that happen. And we've also got to think more broadly about what that revenue looks like.
Good morning, Kevin Brubaker from the Environmental Law and Policy Center. I was really delighted by your comment a moment ago about the importance of having a program where we really can trust government. I know you don't want to get into specific projects, but I think it's important to recognize that all infrastructure proposals are not equal. There are some very worthy projects out there. We are on the verge of being able to capitalize on $1 billion federal investment in intercity passenger rail in the state. And yet, that investment could be undermined by severe operating restraints right now, where we need to cut Amtrak service at the very time it's about to explode. And on the other hand, of course, we have billion-dollar proposals out there for projects that CMAP is, of course, very familiar with and very critical of. And until taxpayers believe that government is making the right decisions to maximize the value of their investments, it's going to be very hard to raise the necessary funds.
You know, this governor is very, very much about metrics. It's about how are we making sure we are investing in a way that gets to the goals that we've set. You know, the federal government has been pushing on performance measures and pushing forward. In the past, we've kind of waited for them. We're not waiting anymore. We need to get ahead of this game, and we need to do just that. We need to make smarter decisions with the limited money that we have. No matter what happens in this system coming up and hopefully soon in revenue, we're never going to have all the money we need. We've got to make sure that we're prioritizing in a way that meets the goals of the state and the people of the state, and we can show that that's what we're doing. So no question, we've got to be smarter about how we spend money. I got time for a couple more. Yeah.
Pension investments. And as we all know, pension investments are something that takes a very long time frame of kind of how you do that investment. It lines up very well with how you do infrastructure investments. Is there a way to have some of this investment money that we're going to be putting into these pension funds provide a source of capital for some of the infrastructure needs here in the state? $100 billion could go a long way.
Good point. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think we should look at it. Let me tell you, I'm looking for any revenue source that's sustainable and grows. And there's nothing off the table for us. But I think that's an interesting thought I'd never considered.
Jim Mann from the MPC board. Quick question about, we talk so much about transportation infrastructure. I just want to remind us that there are a lot of pieces that when one is working on the transportation elements, you need to take into account that if you dig the road up, we need to worry about what's underneath it, the underground. There's also the connection, as you yourself noted, to natural areas and recreation and parks. And I think as we talk about an infrastructure program, we need to be sure that all of the elements are together and also that they're coordinated so that we don't pave the road and then dig it up for the underground.
Yeah, and I know you're going to do a water section later on this morning, but you know, I tell people that at least you can see the damage on our system. You can't see it on pipes. And that's a serious problem. And it's, those pipes are as old as our roads and bridges. So we've got to figure out a way to take care of that. Usually on this trip with me is the Capital Development Board, and they've been talking about vertical infrastructure, schools, public buildings, et cetera, just as important. This is not just a capital program for transportation. You happen to get me today, but it is a capital program that deals with infrastructure much more broadly. So, did I see one more back here? One more over here?
Mr. Secretary, Tim Martin from Jacobs. One quick question for Mary Sue and MPC. We have these clickers. Is one of your questions going to be who has an iPass? And the second question, okay, Jack, that's a setup. The second question, who knows how much they paid on their iPass last month?
Yeah.
So, in terms of sustainable, things like that. But the question at hand, you've talked about at the end of this capital program, you're going to be farther behind than you were at the end of the last capital program. Chairman Dillard last week talked about his only focus is maintaining and his need for billions to maintain his existing system, not improve it. Does the legislature understand that there, but by the hard work of IDOT and the tollway and CTA and Metra, there's another 35W waiting out there? Do they know that?
I think that they don't want to think about that, to be honest. We have significant maintenance issues throughout this, and we have the same thing in our airports. We have ports downstate that have significant needs for investment. So part of this tour and part of this messaging back to the General Assembly is to bring to light that we have to take care of what we have. We are an old, established transportation system, and we got to take care of that first. That doesn't mean we don't want to do some of the other things that connect communities, that provide new access, new mobility. But number one, we got to take care of what we got. So, first of all, thank you all for that. It was very helpful, as all of these have been. They've been fun for me. We were learning a lot. We have a panel coming up, but I've got a distinguished panel with me. Let me start at the other end. I have John Picari, the National Director of Strategic Consulting at Parsons Brinckerhoff, former Deputy Secretary of DOT, former Secretary of the Department of Transportation, Maryland, an old friend. John, thanks for coming. Next to him is Rob Fuentes, Senior Fellow at Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, who's done a lot of work here in this area, a lot of work on the things that we really care about financing our transportation system and those connections. So welcome. And I hope you all know Peter Scozzi, the Vice President of MPC. So let me start a little bit about the question that I asked the audience. Why does this matter? Why should we be investing hard taxpayer-earned dollars into this system, and what results should we be expecting? Jan, I'll start with you.
Sure, it's a great question, and I think it's one that taxpayers all over the country are asking. And to me, the bottom line is transportation is economic development. There's a lot of important activities that government does, but transportation is fundamentally different in the sense that it's an enabler of future growth and future prosperity. And if it's done right, that lasts for generations. If you apply the kind of metrics that we all should be applying today, you know the benefit-cost ratio. You know the return on investment that you're getting. And while there are a number of other important priorities out there and generational issues, Social Security, higher education debt, lots of other things, if you want to grow your way out of those things, you need the fundamental infrastructure that lets your economy grow. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, Rep?
I agree with all that. Obviously, I think that the connection between transportation and economic growth and development is one that's well known. I think it's intuitive to a lot of folks. So I agree with all that. It's also very critical for people. I mean, obviously, people need transportation infrastructure to access then economic opportunity, whether it be jobs that they're trying to get to, or education, or recreation, library, shopping, all these things. So when we talk about transport, and there were some comments in the last session about mobility as the metric, and I think that's That start of the shift I think we're starting to see is away from just moving people and moving goods and moving things around, but what do you actually get? What can you access from these things? If we start to put metrics behind some of these investments and you start to look at accessibility as the metric as opposed to mobility, just moving things, I think it really changes the game, and that's what really matters to people.
So ditto. The thing that I find quite remarkable about, and I'll just focus on transportation infrastructure for this panel, but the thing I find quite remarkable about it is that it touches every person's life every single day. Every person's life every single day. If you eat, transportation network brought that food to you. If you go to work, it's the transportation network that gets you there. So it is an amazingly critical issue, but yet our willingness to invest in it is very low, is very small. So we've figured out that the average Illinois resident, if you're an average driver and you drive the average amount of miles with an average car, you contribute about $8.25 a month to Illinois' road fund. $8.25 a month for, I would argue, probably the most critical infrastructure system that you access every single day. I would also argue that you pay 5 to 10 times that much for your monthly cell phone bill. I would argue that you probably pay 10 to 20 times that much for your monthly cable bill. Those are also important infrastructure systems, but I think the transportation system is, as much as I hate to admit it, I could probably live without Netflix for one night, but I really couldn't live without the transportation network. So that, to me, is the reason why this is such a critical issue.
So let's continue on that revenue kind of a conversation. You heard me talk about the boom and bust cycles and the way we have tended to fund transportation here in Illinois. I've told people I don't ever want to hear the term shovel-ready projects again as a way to determine whether or not we're going to build something. We need to have that sustainable revenue flow so that we always have shovel-ready projects that are in fact our priorities. So, give me some examples from a national perspective and from Peter, what you've heard. What are other people doing? How are other people thinking about this differently? How are other states, other regions investing in their infrastructure in ways that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, first of all, Randy, I think you made an important distinction earlier, which is the pay-as-you-go kind of projects, fixing potholes and day-to-day maintenance, and the larger transformative, game-changing projects, which almost without exception have to be financed. You need a funding source that helps you build a finance source for it. And around the country, you're seeing a greater use of public-private partnerships. And at the high end of those, it could be LaGuardia Airport, a new terminal, actually being funded from that. A number of road projects and transit projects. But what I'd point out is you can't finance those projects with the private sector without a core funding source. And the opportunity cost is these big game-changing projects are exactly the ones that don't go forward without stable, consistent funding. I think that the blunt politics of it are, if you're a governor, if you're a transportation secretary, and you're thinking in a 4-year cycle, the reality is you're inheriting projects that someone else has teed up for you. They've spent 4 or 6 or 8 years getting those ready for construction. And you're also supposed to be starting other projects that other people will finish. Without a consistent, stable funding source, are you going to do either of those? Would you take a large project to construction not knowing how you're going to pay for it? And even more to the point, would you spend the millions or tens of millions that are typically required for these major projects in the early planning and environmental and design work when there's no certainty it'll ever go to construction? That, to me, economists call it opportunity cost. I say that's the politics of it. You just wouldn't do those projects.
Yeah. I mean, if it makes you feel any better, as you know, you're not alone. Probably doesn't make you feel any better, but this is a conversation that's happening in many, many states all across the country. There are few that aren't worried about this right now. Some of this is because of what's happening on the federal level. Some of this is because of these just gigantic transformations that are happening with tools like the gasoline tax, which does provide a tremendous source of revenue for many states and on the federal level as well. But as people are driving less, as they're driving more fuel-efficient cars, and as that money gets kind of siphoned off for other areas, it's starting to throw off less revenue And the real question is whether it's going to be a sustainable source for the future. So the shift is starting to happen. So I don't think there's any real good ideas right now, other than to say there's a lot of things that people are working on. I think that part of what's happening is this recognition, as John was saying, is the difference between funding and finance, right? The public-private partnerships are a little bit of a kind of a gold rush mentality that people feel like there's a form they got to fill out, and then there's some P3 money out there someplace, and it doesn't work like that. So the innovations that I think we're seeing are states trying to get their rules, their tools, and their institutions in order to take advantage of these transformations that are happening. So the rules are legislative, the legislation, getting the legislation right so you can do things like take advantage of partnerships when they come about, not privatization, all that kind of stuff, but true partnerships between the public and the private sector and philanthropies and nonprofits. I mean, there's all these different ideas that are out there now, so the rules have to be in place. You have to then have the right tools because you have to do things like maybe make innovative loans like is happening in places like Virginia, trying to do more with less and leveraging the existing funds that they have, trying to stretch that out a little bit more. So putting together the right tools like Virginia has, I think, is a good one. And then the institutions. The challenge that we have for many of these, in many states and many metros is that they have a lot of these institutions that were birthed in the 40s and the 50s when we were building the interstates. And we still have a lot of personnel, we still have a lot of traditions that are still designed to be doing that, when that's not really the model anymore. The interstate era is basically over. It's now a new shift for these issues around accessibility, multimodalism, and then rehabbing and fixing what we've got right now. So the institutions have to reflect the realities of the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. The distinction between financing and funding. Back 5, 6, 7 years ago, I spent pretty much a whole series of meetings with Laura out talking to our delegation and others in D.C. about the difference. Because people, again, we know how to borrow money here in Illinois. We're good at it. But, you know, there's a significant difference, and we've got on all levels of government get to that funding question. New financing mechanisms are great. Anytime you can do it more efficiently, you can save money, that's a great thing. But at the end of the day, we got to start talking seriously about the funding end of that.
And that's where the innovations have been lately, is just on these new financing mechanisms, QPIBs, PABs, BABs, AFFs, you guys have heard these. We're making a lot of progress on that, but it's this latter part that you're saying that we haven't really made the progress on.
Right, and that has been, I think, a large shift in the conversation over the last decade. It was, you know, you passed a revenue bill in the General Assembly, you floated some bonds, you built some projects, and now the financing for a lot of the larger projects across the country start to look like a layer cake of, you know, in the affordable housing arena, we've seen that for years, how you have to piece everything together to make it work, and we're starting to see that now with transportation. And while there is a lot of interest in the private financing, and, you know, Metropolitan Planning Council worked with many in this room to pass the Public-Private Partnership for Transportation Act for Illinois, it is still just a small percentage of the pie, and the challenge remains, though, maintenance, the maintenance of the system, because that's 65 to 80% of the dollars that we spend, and we still haven't come up with creative ways to finance that. It still does often rely upon some of the more traditional sources, and we know those sources are falling short.
So can we talk about that for just a minute? I mean, my question has always been that, you know, how long are we going to continue to fund infrastructure with smoke and mirrors? You know, are we going to continue to fund transportation on cigarette taxes and gambling?
Literally smoke, right?
Literally smoke and mirrors. You know, let's talk about user fees versus some of these more, you know, innovative or different types of revenue, not financing, but revenue streams. And, you know, have things worked out there? And we know that, you know, the fact that the gas tax is not, in my opinion, a sustainable source over time. It's what we have today, and we probably need to continue to take advantage of it. But it's not going to be where we want to be. So how do we think about user fees differently? How do we think about non-user fees but still being fair and equitable across those beneficiaries of the system? What thoughts do you have on that?
I think we all understand the gas tax is not sustainable at the federal or state level over the long term. And arguably, that's actually a good thing in the sense that what's driving that are things like efficiency in the corporate average fuel economy, electrification of the fleet. Those are important for the nation, but are accelerating the decline of it as a stable funding source. there's a lot of things you can look at. None of them are easy. I'd point in particular to the vehicle miles tax because it's fair in the sense that users continue to pay or not pay, depending on whether or not you're using the road network that day. The technical feasibility is there. There are some issues. There are some, including the cost of collection of it. One of the great things about the gas tax is it's one of the cheapest taxes in administrative terms to collect. That's not true vehicle mile tax necessarily. But there are a number of political issues with it, as there are with any other funding source. I would point out that the courage and the innovation is actually happening at the local and state level, not the federal level now. And there are a number of states that have raised the gas tax, indexed it, added new funding sources, used sales tax for transportation revenues, and they've all lived to tell the tale. Those governors have actually survived. So it can happen, and even with a less stable federal partner, and it pains me to say this, I think that trend will accelerate, if anything. The state and to some extent local part of it through self-help measures will continue.
I don't have much to add. I think that's all right. I think that what we're seeing on the state level is states. It's not just blue states that are raising their gas taxes. Red states like Wyoming have done it as well. So I think there is a myth that the gas tax is unpopular. We heard this in Washington all this week for Infrastructure Week. But Governor Rendell points out when they raised the gas tax in Pennsylvania, not one legislator who voted for the increase lost their election in the next cycle. So I think that the challenge we have at the federal level is that it's a bit of a black box, and that if you just raise this tax and just trust us, it's all going to work out fine. What we see on the state level, and the lower you get, you see a bigger connection, a brighter line between the money that's being raised, the projects that are being invested in, and then the outcomes at the end of the day. As much as we can continue to do that, and again, I think it's easier the lower you get, and draw those bright lines between those investments and the economic opportunities that result from that, the people are more than willing to pay. We heard some comments about this earlier today. I think people are willing to invest if they know what they're getting, but it's got to be clear.
So again, ditto, ditto. But I would also add, I want to combine two conversations or two concepts that we've been talking about already. One, this notion of performance measures and accessibility versus mobility, the older paradigm of just how many people are we moving versus the newer paradigm of how many people are getting to where they want to go. And that's a very important distinction because it really brings the land use side of the equation into it. And then being a planner, that's very important to me. So we've had this debate at the national level as people have talked about, oh, Chicago has, this really high index for congestion, and that's really bad. Well, okay, but if you're really only traveling 15 minutes in severe congestion to get where you want to go versus traveling 45 minutes on a free-flowing highway, which is better, right? So that's an important issue, accessibility versus mobility. What that reveals, or what that illustrates to us, of course, is that transportation investments increase the value of adjacent properties. We know that. That's one of the reasons we've talked about that already. And so the concept of value capture and using that as an additional source of revenue or financing for projects is becoming more and more prevalent. The Denver Union Station is a model we like to point to. Value capture, as Denver Union Station was rebuilt and more office development was taking place there, the increased value of the real estate and collected more taxes, and that helped to finance the Denver Union Station investment. That mechanism, that model, is something we're trying to replicate here in Illinois as well. We're working on a bill with several legislators in Springfield this session to try to get that passed for some key projects in the region. But again, that's just another layer on the layer cake. That's not going to be the entire cake. It's going to be another source of revenue and another source of financing. But I think it starts to broaden the conversation even beyond simply user fees and the network itself, but really to the broader picture of land use and accessibility.
So let's take that next step in to talk about outcomes and how we determine priorities. We here in Illinois and our staff do a really good job on performance measures like road condition and bridge condition and safety. We don't do as good a job about economic access, about impacts on communities. How do we need to move forward to make sure that we are making the right decisions and making the right investments to get the outcomes that we want? Where should we be headed in all of this, quote, performance measure, performance-based programming activity go? Because that's where we have to be, I believe.
I think there's a combination of both the very local, the neighborhood-based part, and the larger regional. And you have to take both into account. And if you start with the regions, which are the basic economic units in this country and around the world, the competitors for Chicagoland are actually not so much domestic ones, they're international ones. And as you're thinking about competitiveness, think about the natural advantages that you've capitalized on for 150 years. And you talked about those earlier, connecting the Great Lakes to the world's most productive inland water system, aviation, rail hub of the country. But how likely is that to continue? And if you look at it not just mode by mode, but from an overall mobility point of view, and specifically goods movement as well, because we talk about moving people, it's very important. Goods movement drives the economy, and that has always been the natural competitive advantage that this region has had. So from the macro point of view, you need to be ask yourself hard questions about how likely is that to continue, and if you want it to continue and in fact accelerate, what projects drive that? As you point out, you also do need, obviously, to be have it consistent with local land use. You have to be consistent with community issues. Those are not incompatible. But if you don't take the 30,000-foot view, like your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did in this region, I think the future for the region is not nearly as bright.
Yeah, and I think it starts with economic planning. What I'd like to see, and it's hard to do because of the siloed nature that we make these decisions, is a tighter connection between the transportation process and the economic vision that cities and states and metros are laying out. So World Business Chicago kind of laid out their plan, the economic plan for the region and economic vision. The next step is then to align the investments underneath that economic plan. So if you're trying to boost exports, for example, because to take advantage of rising global demand for goods and services, that then leads you then to a series of projects that you need to invest in, whether it's the airport or it's the seaport or broadband telecommunications. Those have to then be derivative of an economic vision in order to get the best bang for the buck. Otherwise, I think you're right, we're just going to start measuring the same traditional things, and we're going to almost kind of game the system in a lot of ways. It's not going to really result in better projects unless if you're shooting for an economic outcome, it's much better than shooting for a transportation outcome.
And that having those regional plans and having those goals to drive the investment is certainly where one starts. We have some good planning that's taken place in this region, and we should build on that and continue to build on that. I think the state needs to also figure out what its statewide goals are, and not just have the alignment of transportation investments towards those goals, but also your open space investments, your brownfields redevelopment investments, your affordable housing investments. These are all sources of capital that the state is deploying, and they need to, one, be aligned so they're working in concert, but two, also be subservient to those statewide goals. So that's really important, and I'm not sure that we have that. I don't think we have a clear vision of exactly how we're going to do that. I think Illinois, like many states, has long had political horse trading drive the capital selection process more than anything. Just a quick note on the federal side. The inclusion of some performance metrics in MAP 21 was a welcome evolution. But it did fall short. I think the economic development performance measures in MAP 21 were not as robust as they could have been, and there were really no references to any kind of social equity or sort of more personal metrics. It's, again, we've talked about it already on this panel, but we can measure how transportation investments improve individuals' quality of life. We can see how they reduce or increase your access to work, i.e. reduce your commute time or give you greater job opportunities. That's something we can measure. How are we connecting people to jobs better? We can actually measure how that's reducing your overall household expenditures by having more efficient and affordable transportation options. Those should be part of the equation, and we need to start driving our investments to meet those objectives as well.
You know, I really love telling this story that when I was at IDOT before and I was traveling with the former secretary, and I said, transportation isn't a goal, it's a strategy for other things, and he stopped the car and asked me to get out. But it really is, and I think you all make a good point, and maybe if we can just take that next step in what you've seen other places, because we are a new administration. How do we connect our economic planning with our transportation planning, not only at the state level, but at the regional level as well? Rob, you're doing a lot of work around the country. Where are people doing it in a way that makes sense? And John, from your experience in Maryland, did you have that there?
Absolutely. At the state level, we looked at the growth corridors in Maryland, some of the biotech I-270 corridor, for example, and that drove some of the most significant state investment, transportation investment. It was about mobility, but it was also about land use and connecting different parts of the state, as well as supporting smart growth as a goal. So very much so. I think we all need to take a step back and remember transportation is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And if your end is economic development, it's the best investment you can make.
And I don't want to give you the impression that anybody's doing this perfectly, because nobody is. Again, there's a lot of transition going on. Now, a lot of folks asking these same kinds of questions. I think San Francisco is starting to do this well, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission there. They throw a bunch of projects into, I don't mean this to flip, they put a bunch of projects into this model, and then the projects that come out on top, those are the ones that get funded. The ones that don't have to go back and be relooked. There's a lot into it more than that, but that's what we're starting to see. And I think a lot of folks are looking at the San Francisco model and trying to replicate it elsewhere. The value that has is what we also like internationally, and we like what they had done in the UK, this is going back 10 years ago now, where they were starting to align, they were measuring those projects and then funding the ones that came up with the best return on investment. And we asked the folks there, we said, well, how do you get around the politicians, choosing this? He said, well, those projects are not the ones that they necessarily fund automatically, but the politicians then have to stand up in light of all this evidence that shows that's a crummy project, and then they still have to make that decision. So the transparency drove a lot of the accountability in that case, and I think that's what we're starting to see in other places around the country.
Yeah, I do think that transparency is really important. We have our biggest project going on here in this region is the Circle Interchange, and it came a little bit out of nowhere on us, and we didn't say it was a bad project. It's just how did we get to this decision? I think would have been much more helpful in being able to sell the benefits that are truly going to come from it. Peter?
So not to give too much kudos to Randy in his former role, but I do think CMAP has a good process similar to MTC's. The modeling capacity that CMAP has allows them to perform that kind of analysis, to put the projects into the hopper and really measure on, I think there's 14 different criteria that CMAP looks at, and that's great. It becomes challenging as you start to get outside the Chicago metropolitan region. Other metropolitan planning organizations across the state don't have those capabilities. Many of the MPOs are part-time staff or even just a volunteer chairman. So they need some resources, and that suggests that even before we can invest on the capital side of transportation, we need to invest on the planning side, and we need to figure out how those models work and how we can spread that technology statewide. I know this is another issue that Randy's now grappling with in his role at IDOT, is how do we find a consistent set of metrics that make sense across the state, and then how can we give people the tools to even measure for those? And that's a big challenge, but that's one that is often overlooked as we rush to build something or pave something or rebuild something. We've got to do that groundwork at the beginning to do the good planning.
So it is about the economic benefits, but it's also about community benefits, and those are just as hard in many ways to measure, and maybe in some ways harder. you know, as I said, transportation defines in so many ways our communities. How should we be thinking about the investments we make and the impacts that they have on communities and their health and the quality of life of those residences? Because it's more than just about the economy. It's about a lot of connections.
So has been, I think, for years, at least on the planning side, there's been a lot of discussion about the connection between health and community planning. And I think the planners in the room have, we remember 10, 15 years ago, well, if we have more walkable communities, well, people will be more fit because they'll be walking more places. And I think that notion has really started to catch on, at least amongst the planning and folks perhaps in this room. Where I think there's an opportunity to really expand upon that is bringing in much more consciously and forcefully the role of public hospitals, nonprofit hospitals in the community. So as the Affordable Care Act is getting rolled out, hospitals are starting to think differently about what healthy means and what healthcare treatment means. It's as much about keeping people out of the clinics and the emergency rooms and putting them in healthy communities. So there are some nonprofit hospitals in the region that are making investments in quality, affordable housing that provides a safer, healthy environment, that are making investments in transportation options. And so, again, I think this is about connecting transportation and where the rubber hits the road on physical improvements in the community, connecting those conversations to health, to recreation, to education, because we know it's so critical to all of those concerns, but we haven't done a good job of really engaging those other actors. There's a whole host of constituents out there that really aren't at, are there any nonprofit hospitals in the room that aren't at these discussions?
That's an excellent question, Randy, because it really drives the question of community benefit agreements. I'm a big believer in that process. And in simple terms, it means you're sitting down with the community as the project is being conceived, before it's designed, before alternatives are selected. And community benefits can be narrowly or broadly defined. And to me, it's about squeezing every drop of value out of the public money that you're putting into a project. As some of them have been mentioned, there are others as well. It may be local employment, it may be manufacturing, and even if these work at the margins add up.
And I think what you're doing, going around the state and listening to communities is really the first step. And we don't do it enough in this field, as you probably know. A lot of your constituents don't do it, so I applaud you for doing that. To engage the community, you've got to ask them, and they'll tell you, as you've probably seen. But I think that people have a really, really great understanding of the kind of investments and the kind of what they want from a transport department, even though they don't talk about it the way that we do. We don't talk about QPIBs and other things the same way, but people are really attuned and very sophisticated to these things. So listening, I think, really, really matters. You'll start to hear things that then get you out of the transportation realm. I think we already heard this today, but people hate when the roads are dug up once for one purpose, then dug up again for water, and then dug up again for telecommunications. And so trying to make those things seem more rational to people, right, which they think is just crazy. Why would you do this 3 times? Well, there's a good reason for it. You can name all the reasons, but they still don't understand that dysfunction that comes that way. So listening, taking those good ideas where you can, and then making those easy, I think, decisions are really a first step.
So, we saw the Transportation Isn't Sexy video, and if you haven't seen the whole video, you truly have to watch it. It's hilarious. But we tend to talk, when we talk about transportation investment, about expanding the system, and that's important. Providing more access to more communities but you don't put an addition on when the roof's leaking, right? So how do we balance, and how do other states balance and other communities balance that need for better access to maintaining a system that needs it, and where does that trade-off go, and how do we think about it in a different way than we have before?
Another great question. I don't think that there's any one simple answer. I've never worked with a jurisdiction at the local or state level that hasn't said fix it first is their religion, where their first dollar goes to maintaining the system they have. That's often honored in the breach, and often because you don't have an alternative. One suggestion is that if you're using the base funding that you have for system preservation, for fix it first, then that gives you an opportunity through local self-help initiatives, a bond referendum, for example, to show the expansion projects. And there's a very strong history nationwide of approval of these local self-help projects. I think it's 72% of the projects over the last 10 years at the local level have been approved. And the reason is simple. If you do it right, you're telling people exactly what you're going to get in terms of projects and when you're going to get it. And if you're paying attention at all, you've built that list based on what you're hearing from the communities. And it's kind of the original performance measure. You are telling them exactly what you're going to deliver and when. And if you've crafted that carefully, you're going to be successful. So it's not a total strategy, but one way to focus on the fix it first part and have an opportunity for expansion is to bifurcate them and to do it through local self-help measures.
I agree with all that.
I would only add, too, that it is a mantra that everybody espouses. But there are probably some instances where we might not even fix something. There is likely infrastructure in Illinois, there's likely infrastructure in other states around the country that was built for a certain time or a certain era that no longer performs that function. Maybe the population centers have shifted, maybe the industry has changed, and maybe we no longer need that piece of infrastructure exactly as it was built or designed 60, 100 years ago. And so that really even becomes a much more challenging discussion. Because not only are you not going to fix something, you might have to consciously abandon it. And that's a conversation we need to have, quite frankly, as well, because we can't just continue, again, to rebuild everything if it's not providing the same level of impact that it once did.
So one more for you guys, and then I want to allow the audience to ask some questions of this group while we've got them in town. But let's talk serious multimodal planning and investment. We talk about it. We talk about it a lot. At the federal level, the funding is relatively stovepiped. At the state level, it is the same. And so we say, yes, we need to spend money where it's the most needed, and yet our funding streams don't allow it. Our congressional committees won't even want to talk about giving up jurisdiction of what they own. How do we really get into what I think all of this group and all of us in this industry want to get to, which is truly multimodal decision making? What is the best solution to a problem that we're facing, and not what funding stream do we have to pay for it, and then we find a solution that meets that?
I'm very biased on this issue. Although I served at the federal level, I think being a state DOT secretary is really where the action is and where the rubber meets the road in a lot of ways and on projects. And if you're not familiar with Maryland DOT, it's unlike all the other ones in the country. So everything's under one roof. BWI Airport, statewide transit system, statewide highway system, bridge and tunnel authority, the port, everything is under one roof, and it's one trust fund. And what you see around the country is a lot of states struggling mightily against these institutional barriers that they have. They have an airport authority and a transit authority and a port authority, all of which are doing good things, but none of which are incentivized to work together. Now, it's not perfect in Maryland, and there are certainly trade-offs that happen, but I had the great advantage, and I can admit this now that I'm not in the federal government anymore, of being able to use landing fees at the airport to fund transit, or use toll revenues to build parking garages. There are states that are moving that way. Massachusetts might be a good example right now. But breaking those institutional barriers, and from a finance and debt point of view, it can be done. Some of the hardest barriers are political and institutional, but you have states where the DOTs and the authorities that are their counterparts are set up to fail because they just can't accommodate the needs of the future.
Yeah, I think some of it starts, it's really not sexy. It's really about the organization of the state departments and the bureaucracies within them. And I like what they're doing in New York with this New York Works Task Force, which is kind of, it's one idea, but a bunch of other places are doing it. The federal government is doing it. And it's just tasking one person with making sure that these different agencies, these different departments are all linked up on projects. So it's not the planning phase, it's a much later in the game. But for things just like one-stop shopping, so if you need approvals, you get it from one office instead of multiple offices. Similar forms in similar places. And so it's one person just kind of running the point and just making sure that these different organizations are paying attention to one another, trying to accelerate projects. That's the goal. But as a result, I think that winds up making some of those brighter connections and crossing some of those institutional barriers that are tough to do before. And then I give credit to the federal government for the Tiger Grants program that they did. It was a competitive program that actually kind of almost incentivized, and it really kind of forced places to get together and to join up land use, housing, transport, environment in their applications because there was a little bit of money that was there. And just a little bit of money we see goes a long way these days.
Our region is envious of the streamlined planning approach. I think CMAP has done, again, a laudable job to try to at least bring everybody to the same table so the conversations can be had together. But we still have a lot of bifurcation, trifurcation, multifurcation between IDOT and the Toll Highway Authority and CTA Metro and PACE and CMAP's overall planning role. And so there's a long way to go, not only to coordinate on the planning side, but then to even take that to I think the ultimate step and coordinate on the financing side. John, I suppose we'll be studying Maryland, all that more closely.
So I want to open this up to you all to allow you to ask some questions of this group and gain their experience while they're here in town. So questions? Yes, back in the back.
You talk about fix it first, and that can't do. What about facilities that have been allowed to deteriorate so badly it's no longer fixed it, it's really an expansion project? And in the case of the Chicago region, we look at our port district, and I give credit to the city of Chicago for trying to find private investors to help renew that facility. But I'm struck by the fact that, hey, the city did not succeed on that in its first go-round. And secondly, as a region, we've been designated a metal manufacturing region, and that identity depends on something like the port district, where so much of our metals come in as raw ores. What do we do with that?
I think the point you raise that maintenance has gotten so deferred that much of our infrastructure has gotten to the point of obsolescence is only a sad reflection of the truth. Even as we talked about the Circle Interchange project, that's 80% of that, 90% of that's a maintenance project because it's a 50-year-old structure and it has to be maintained. We have to rebuild that. But the same thing is true with the red-purple line on the north side of Chicago, where sections are still 100 years old. Water pipes we'll talk about on future panels, 100 years old. And so I don't have an answer to it. It only is just, I think, a stark illustration of really how bad the problem has become.
I would hearken back to the economic development discussion we had a few minutes ago. If there's truly a regional economic development strategy, you also have to make hard choices. You can't do everything, and you're looking at the assets that you have, the institutional anchors and others, and you're also looking at the kinds of employment mix that you're trying to get. Ports are a great one. Again, the Maryland example, we lost our steel industry, we lost our auto industry, and suddenly the Port of Baltimore was by far the largest blue-collar employer in the state, by far. 19,000 direct jobs, and those are good-paying, family-supporting jobs. So we made it part of the economic development strategy to grow that port, knowing that the other parts of that niche, blue-collar jobs, were gone and were not coming back.
And that's where I think the freight, I agree with that. It's where it connects. We see a lot of cities and metros and states are starting to develop freight plans that then lead to projects, and it's mostly around just moving trucks and moving vehicles, which is fine. But when you start to do another layer of analyses down, so Minneapolis is a great example that was kind of going to embark on an effort just to build a lot of projects to free up freight movement, to free up the velocity of freight. But we did some analysis for them and realized that so much of their economy is based on high-value, low-weight products, medical instruments. Such a huge focus of their economy. That really wasn't part of the freight plan, but that stuff is all moved by air to China and to Europe. So if they really want to improve their economy and they really want to use freight as a way to address it, the airport matters so much more to them than freeing up some of these truckways. So some of the specificity matters.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
So while appreciating your comments on some of the local and state environment relative to transportation, and also appreciating some states and some local and state governments have gotten it right, there's a fair amount of state and local governments that aren't getting it right with respect to, you've seen votes out to the residents of particular states where they've turned down statewide tax increases, whether it be gas or sales tax increase. In particular, last week, the state of Michigan, by 80-20 vote, the people sent it back to the governor's office because they turned down a sales tax increase for roads. So, it appears to me there is a lot of work to be done between government and the people. And when you look at, in particular, the state of Michigan, it was resounding no. And so it strikes me as that, and I know you guys get this, but it has to be more than, hey, here's the projects and here's what we're going to do with your money. I'm just curious in some additional views on how do we connect the dots between the government and the people?
I think part of it is demonstrating that there's a new way of doing business. This is coming up a lot in the transit field in Washington and in Boston and places where there's a lot of mistrust from the riders in particular that if fares go up, that they're going to be able to invest those revenues in the right way. So what I think is starting to happen in these places is the governors are coming in and the mayors are coming in and saying that, and trying to demonstrate and really be clear and articulate that we're not going to do things the same old way, that we recognize that there's a problem and we're going to have to fix it internally before we start to get additional revenue. I don't know if that's what happened in Michigan or not, but I think if folks don't trust the way the money's going to be spent, they're not going to be supportive. So again, transparency, accountability, and just being clear that there's a new way of getting things done is really going to be important, I think.
So again, our Metropolitan Planning Council's latest effort to bring awareness and attention to this issue is Accelerate Illinois. We started that work really by surveying about 400 Illinois residents late last year to literally ask them, what is it about your experience with the transportation network that bothers you, and how can, what needs to be done? And perhaps predictably, a lot of the responses were simply the everyday challenges. It's the bus bunching, it's the potholes, it's the crumbling bridges and whatnot. And that's what everyday residents want to see fixed. So one, knowing that is important, but then also did a lot of surveying, or questions in the survey asking them, well, how much do you pay now? How much would you be willing to pay? Would you be willing to look at these different types of expenditures? Is it a dollar more on a T-shirt representing a sales tax and so forth? And there's some correlation between interest or less resistance, shall I say, to the user fee approach. But the resounding issue that sort of stopped everything in its tracks was, again, trust in how the dollars were going to be spent. Wisconsin just passed a state constitutional amendment requiring that the road fund can't be swept and must be spent on infrastructure improvements. So, maybe it's going to come to that. And in the General Assembly or in Springfield this past spring, unfortunately, we had to sweep funds out of the road fund to balance the budget. So that only adds to the public's suspicion.
Yeah.
Oh, microphone. Stand up.
I think you answered my question, because I think one of the problems we have here in Illinois is that it's not just this year that money's been swept out of the road fund. I think that it's been a continual thing, and I think that when you ask people to pay more, I agree with the gentleman earlier who said, I'd pay more in gas taxes, but I don't know in Illinois because we don't have a trust fund. Our highway trust fund is not a trust fund, and that money can get swept for other budget needs. So I think that the confidence of the people that paying higher taxes is actually going to fix that bridge, improve that transit project, improve our ports, it just isn't there. And I don't know how we get there.
Right here in front, and then we'll go.
Dick Gill with...
It's working.
It's on.
It's on? Dick Gill with Brunel Albano. We seem to spend an awful lot of time and energy fighting with our neighboring states, particularly Wisconsin and Indiana. My question is, well, highways don't stop at the state line, and neither do the trucks. To what extent is there any interstate cooperation on dealing with infrastructure? And if there isn't, or if there isn't enough, what would be the prospects for more of it, and how effective might it be?
Yeah, you know, I'll talk about it from where we are and where we're going, and you can talk about it from your experience. I think it's really important. You know, infrastructure in general knows no political boundaries. Economies know no political boundaries, and we have to think about it that way. I have reached out to the commissioners and secretaries of our surrounding states to have conversations about where do these connections make sense? How do we work better together? We've had a little bit of this always because we are a state that's surrounded significantly by rivers, and so we have to work with our neighbors on those bridge issues. But it's got to be more than that. And you know, we got to quit poking each other in the eye. You know, to be perfectly honest, we've got to find ways to work together to make those connections, because up here, significant numbers of people that live in Northwest Indiana work here in Chicago, and you know, we've got to understand that that's part of our economy too. John?
Yeah, it's a great question, and to me, it's one of the few glimmers of hope at the federal level, because you need to think of the transportation system as local and state systems that are aggregated into a national one, because that's really how it works, and especially when you're talking individual projects, that's how it works. But at the federal level, there's broad bipartisan support behind the scenes in a surface transportation authorization for two kind of large concepts. One is the idea of regions, and how do we make and help regions grow through transportation. And the second is goods movement. And on the goods movement part of it, states are required now to have a state freight plan. The smart states not only have a multimodal freight plan, but it is tied to their neighbors. It doesn't end at the state borders. And some states have done a really good job with that. And again, I think that's kind of an economic development strategy. So you can see that if and when there is the courage for a longer-term funding solution on the federal side, some of the policies that I believe should go with that in a reauthorization on freight policy and developing regions. And most of the regions around the country are at or spanning state boundaries. So those things kind of naturally come together, and you should keep your eye on the ball on both the policy side and the funding side for ways to incentivize that kind of behavior. And again, it's one of the few bipartisan discussions that you're really seeing on Capitol Hill behind the scenes.
We have time for one more. Mike?
I'm Michael Davidson. I'm with the Chicago Community Trust. Thank you. This has been very, very interesting conversation. I have also a coordination question, but it's coordination internally in the state of Illinois. So I think it's, Randy, the question is mostly directed at you. Peter, of course, you'll have something to say about it. But John, I'm inspired by your comments about Maryland. You know, Maryland has a long history of thoughtful planning, smart growth, going back to Paris, Glendenning back in the day. We were inspired by him for a long time here. And so my question, Randy, is just about, you know, we've been talking about transportation, and I often think of transportation as sort of the lymph system in the human body. It's not particularly sexy. It's very much behind the scenes, but it props the whole system up. And we've talked about human health outcomes, we've talked about land use, we've talked about economic development. We haven't talked too much today about transportation being a means to an end to natural resources conservation, which I believe that it is. The greenest thing we can do in this state is build a robust transit network. It's a pretty green thing to do. So, Randy, internally at IDOT and at the state level, what kind of coordination is happening across state agencies, departments, et cetera? Are there systems being put in place? Is the culture changing so that agency directors talk with one another and coordinate resources?
Yeah, I think that the culture is definitely changing. I have conversations with other directors in state agencies and their staffs, and our staffs talk together constantly. Because we have figured out, even though the structure isn't in place yet, that we have to do that. We have to do that in order to be successful. We have a new deputy governor here whose job is primarily to make sure that happens. And so I think that the structure still needs to grow. We still need to figure out how to make it work from that structural standpoint. In the meantime, the directors aren't waiting for that, and I think that's really good news. I was on a panel last week with our DCEO director to talk about the things that we spent a lot of time about this morning is, how do we use our transportation investments to drive those economic goals? And I think the same is true with DNR that we're having about how are we making sure we're coordinating to make sure that what we're doing on our natural resources side, we're helping and not hurting. So I think there are still some things we could do structurally that could more formalize that. But as long as we're talking, I'm not all that concerned about it yet. Well, thank you so much to the panel. I appreciate their time and their expertise. And thank you all for letting me steal part of MPC's show to do my listening tour and to really hear from what matters to you all and to make sure that we are really putting together a capital plan and proposal that reflects your needs. So thank you very much, everybody. Peter?